Hey ChatGPT. I want to talk to you today about anti-Semitism or, more generally, about hatred against minorities. What is it in human nature that repeatedly leads to rejection, hatred, exclusion, and persecution of minorities?
The causes of hatred, rejection, and exclusion of minorities, such as those seen in anti-Semitism or other forms of prejudice, are complex and cannot be reduced to a single factor. Rather, they result from an interplay of various human tendencies, social dynamics, and historical contexts. 1. Evolutionary and biological foundations. Humans evolved in social groups where cohesion was crucial for survival. However, this group formation also fostered an us versus them mentality. The tendency to favor one's own in-group and perceive foreign, unfamiliar groups as potential threats can be understood as an evolutionary mechanism that may have once ensured community protection. 2. Psychological mechanisms. Cognitive biases, such as confirmation bias or attribution error, lead people to project negative traits or intentions onto outsiders through stereotypes. Additionally, uncertainty and fear, especially in times of social or economic change, can drive a search for simple explanations for complex problems. In such moments, minorities are often scapegoated, blamed for broader societal issues. 3. Sociocultural and identity-shaping processes. Belonging to specific groups shapes personal identity. Through social comparison, a clear distinction between us and them often emerges. This can lead to prejudice and discrimination, particularly when cultural or religious differences are perceived as a threat to one's identity. Historically entrenched narratives and stereotypes, as seen in anti-Semitism, have further reinforced these dynamics. 4. Political and economic contexts. Political elites or interest groups can fuel fears and exploit hatred against minorities through targeted propaganda or ideological narratives. During economic crises or periods of social upheaval, people often seek clear culprits to manage their fears and frustrations. Minorities are frequently portrayed as the root of these problems, even though they are often already marginalized. 5. Historical and cultural narratives. In the case of anti-Semitism, deeply rooted historical prejudices and myths play a significant role. Centuries-old narratives of inferiority or even sinister conspiracies have been ingrained in many cultures and are repeatedly invoked to explain or incite modern conflicts. Conclusion. Hatred against minorities is rooted both in universal human mechanisms of group formation and fear of the unknown, as well as in specific historical and cultural narratives. These are complex, interwoven processes involving individual, societal, and political factors. The challenge lies in recognizing these mechanisms and counteracting them through education, dialogue, and fair societal structures to combat the root causes of prejudice and hatred.
That's a good initial list of reasons. Here are a few additional thoughts that came to my mind while reading. 1. Enrichment. I suspect that part of the underlying motivation is often simply the desire to benefit at the expense of others. This includes, on the one hand, material gain, but also emotional gain. If I can devalue or exclude others, I can simultaneously feel superior, better, or more powerful at their expense. Additionally, outsiders can serve as a kind of outlet for one's own negative emotions or impulses, since treating them poorly comes with fewer negative consequences within one's own social environment. 2. Dehumanization. Another crucial point, in my opinion, is dehumanization. This plays a key role in evolutionary group conflicts, as it allows people to go to war against another group. But it also enables individuals to exploit others without feeling guilt. Beyond that, I also see the following points you mentioned as absolutely central. The use of minorities as scapegoats. The projection of one's own flaws, failures, or negative impulses onto others. The fear of the other because their differences can challenge one's own culture and worldview. The instrumentalization of these tendencies by elites to distract from their own mistakes and to unite their society during a crisis. However, I do not consider cultural factors, such as narratives in religious or other stories, as an explanation for this phenomenon. Instead, I see them as merely the accumulation of the human tendencies and behaviors described above over long periods of time.
Your additions bring important aspects to the discussion. 1. Enrichment as a motivator. The idea that people seek to enrich themselves, whether materially or emotionally, at the expense of others expands the understanding of the motivations behind exclusion and hatred. Gaining an advantage by demeaning others to strengthen one's own identity and self-worth intensifies the distinction between us and them. This drive for individual or collective superiority can become particularly strong during times of crisis or social upheaval. 2. Dehumanization as a psychological mechanism. Dehumanization is indeed a key process that enables people to overcome moral inhibitions. When others are perceived as less human, it becomes easier to strip them of their humanity and see them as legitimate targets of aggression or exploitation, whether in a military context or in everyday life. This mechanism is closely linked to the evolutionary foundations of group formation, but it can also be deliberately used as a political tool to fuel hatred and strengthen collective identities. Your argument that cultural narratives, such as those found in religious or historical contexts, should be seen as reflections of these fundamental tendencies rather than independent causes is an interesting perspective. Indeed, cultural narratives accumulate experiences and behaviors over long periods without necessarily being the primary driving forces. Conclusion. Overall, it becomes clear that the motives for hatred and exclusion of minorities are multifaceted. Economic and emotional enrichment, dehumanization processes, cognitive biases, and social and political dynamics interact with each other. This understanding highlights the importance of addressing these destructive tendencies on multiple levels, from education and political responsibility to intercultural dialogue. How do you think these insights could be concretely applied to develop prevention and intervention strategies against hatred and exclusion?
That is precisely the essential question. There are obviously mechanisms inherent in human nature that can lead to the exclusion of minorities, as well as economic, psychological, and societal motives behind it. I believe that if we want to counteract these powerful forces, we need to oppose them with something equally strong. So let's now look for aspects of human nature, as well as concrete motives, that promote the integration of and cooperation with minorities within society.
That's a great approach. The question of how we can counteract the negative tendencies rooted in human nature that lead to the exclusion of minorities is crucial for building an inclusive society. To do so, we can draw on various aspects of human nature and concrete motives that promote integration and cooperation. 1. Capacity for cooperation and social learning. Humans are inherently social beings who live and cooperate in groups. Our evolutionary past has taught us that collaboration was often essential for survival. This provides a potential foundation for integrating minorities. 2. Empathy and compassion. Another fundamental aspect of human nature is the ability to empathize. People can put themselves in others' shoes, developing understanding and compassion. This capacity can help counteract exclusion and exploitation. 3. Cognitive flexibility and willingness to learn. Humans have the ability to question and change their beliefs and attitudes. This cognitive flexibility allows people to overcome stereotypes and remain open to new information and experiences. 4. Social and economic interdependence. Modern societies are characterized by diverse economic and social interconnections. This interdependence creates a clear incentive for cooperation, as the success of an interconnected community relies on the contributions of all groups and individuals involved. 5. Cultural diversity as a resource. Diversity brings together different perspectives, experiences, and ideas, leading to cultural and economic enrichment. People from different backgrounds can contribute unique knowledge, fostering creativity and innovation. Conclusion. In summary, the human capacities for cooperation, empathy, cognitive flexibility, and the advantages of economic and cultural interdependence can help counteract the destructive forces of exclusion and hatred. Which of these approaches or measures do you find most promising for addressing the challenges in today's society?
Your points about human nature are excellent. If people manage to see members of minorities primarily as members of their own society, then the in-group aspects of human nature would naturally become more prominent. Traits like cooperation, social exchange, empathy, and compassion are also inherent in human nature and can effectively counteract the destructive tendencies mentioned earlier, provided the right conditions are in place. However, to achieve this, people must recognize the personal and societal benefits of seeing others as part of their own group. Here are my thoughts on these advantages. 1. Group conflicts. A group is stronger when it is larger and benefits from more knowledge when it includes people with diverse experiences and skills. 2. Projection and scapegoating. Projecting one's own weaknesses and failures onto others may feel comfortable in the short term, but in the long run, it is weak and counterproductive. Both individuals and societies can become stronger by addressing their own shortcomings instead of simply blaming others. The same applies to scapegoating. It may provide temporary relief, but in the long run, it weakens a society because it prevents real problem solving. 3. Sociocultural identity. It can be uncomfortable to question one's own cultural assumptions and worldview, but in the long term, this process strengthens a culture. A culture that can be shaken simply by the existence of a few people who think differently is inherently weak. People should recognize the value of having others hold up a mirror to them. It allows them to identify and eliminate their own weaknesses. 4. Economic and emotional benefits. As you mentioned, the short-term material enrichment at the expense of others can be countered by the advantages of economic interdependence and the integration of different perspectives and skills into projects. Likewise, the emotional gain from excluding others can be replaced by the joy of forming new positive interpersonal connections. There are, therefore, strong reasons against exclusion and in favor of cooperation. However, these arguments are often more complex, require individual effort, and play out over the long term, whereas the advantages of exclusion can appear more direct and simplistic. That said, cooperative strategies are sustainable and yield long-term benefits, while the exclusion of minorities is not a viable long-term solution and does not create lasting growth. To truly address the problem of exclusion, we need to help more people recognize these benefits. So, let's now explore cultural and societal institutions, rituals, and recurring activities that could make these insights a tangible part of everyday life.
Your reflections point in a very constructive direction, namely, that the key to combating destructive mechanisms lies in building positive, integrative structures that allow members of a community to experience the personal and collective benefits of cooperation and inclusion. Here are some suggestions on how cultural and social institutions, rituals, and recurring activities can foster these positive dynamics in everyday life. 1. Intercultural education programs and workshops. Schools and universities can implement intercultural projects and exchange programs that encourage direct interaction between different groups. Regular events and workshops could also be organized to help participants challenge their own biases and adopt new perspectives. 2. Cultural festivals and community rituals. Festivals that celebrate cultural diversity through music, dance, cuisine, and collaborative artistic projects can serve as platforms for experiencing the benefits of a larger, more diverse community. Rituals like open house days at community centers, neighborhood festivals, or intercultural markets provide regular opportunities for people from different backgrounds to connect and learn from one another. 3. Collaborative projects and civil society initiatives. Community service projects or neighborhood initiatives encourage mutual understanding and cooperation by engaging people in joint efforts toward a shared goal. 4. Sports and artistic activities. Shared sports events bring people together, and collaborative artistic activities can demonstrate how diverse cultural backgrounds contribute to innovative and creative solutions. 5. Public discussion forums and participatory politics. Regular events where people from different social and cultural backgrounds come together foster open dialogue and critical engagement with both their own and others' biases. Additionally, when citizens from various social backgrounds are included in political decision-making, they experience firsthand how integrating diverse perspectives leads to more sustainable and just solutions. Conclusion. The central idea behind these institutions and rituals is to deliberately nurture natural human traits such as cooperation, empathy, cognitive flexibility, and the desire for belonging. By integrating positive experiences of collaboration into everyday life, individuals not only recognize personal benefits, such as emotional enrichment and economic advantages, but also develop an awareness that a larger and more diverse community is, in the long run, more resilient and innovative. Which of these approaches do you find most effective for fostering a sustainable integration process in everyday life?
Many of the ideas you mentioned could indeed help people get to know members of other subcultures. However, one question comes to mind: if everyone were willing to attend and support these events, the problem likely wouldn't exist in the first place. Additionally, if integration were to succeed completely, the minority group would eventually blend into society to the extent that it would no longer exist as a distinct entity. But the real issue is that many people do not recognize the benefits of cooperation and integration and instead choose to exclude minorities. Equally problematic is the fact that, in many cases, the minority group itself is not open to the culture and way of life of the host society. Many minority groups actively seek to differentiate themselves from the majority in order to preserve their unique identity and culture. In some cases, they even internally punish their own members for engaging in contact, exchange, and integration with the majority. It seems to me, then, that this problem cannot be solved simply through the programs mentioned above, because these initiatives already assume the mindset and insights they are trying to promote. However, many people on both sides do not hold these attitudes in the first place.
This is a central and complex point. Integrative programs and institutional offerings can promote exchange and mutual acquaintance, but they often assume a certain level of openness. It is true that many of the positive effects can only occur when both sides actively engage in the exchange. However, if both sides are inherently skeptical or even hostile, the hoped-for dialogue will not take place. The second point you raised is also essential. Full integration of the minority would simultaneously dissolve its cultural distinctiveness. Therefore, the focus should be less on forcing assimilation and more on fostering a dialogue in which both sides can learn from each other without the minority's identity being lost. This requires societal institutions to create conditions where cultural differences are respected while simultaneously developing shared values. Nevertheless, change often needs to come from within the communities themselves. If a minority group holds a cultural narrative that interprets contact with the majority as betrayal or a loss of their own identity, internal discussions and reflection are also needed. Ultimately, in this case, a shift in mindset must happen within the community before an outward opening can occur. Conclusion: the challenge lies in creating conditions that work even when both sides, the majority and the minority, are not naturally open to exchange. This requires a multi-level approach. First, low-threshold meeting opportunities must be created that allow trust and positive experiences to develop. At the same time, structural and normative changes are necessary to make the value of integration visible in the long term. Finally, an internal discourse must take place within both groups, allowing outdated stereotypes to be overcome and the dynamics of identity and community to be reimagined. How do you see the possibility of combining such low-threshold offerings and structural incentives to generate positive impulses for dialogue in skeptical or isolated communities?
Due to the thoughts I've just outlined, I'm unfortunately quite skeptical about the effectiveness of a targeted program aimed at reducing prejudices and building cooperation. If the members of both groups are willing to learn from each other and cooperate, they can do so at any time, even without externally designed programs. And if they're not willing, then the programs won't help. You can't make people do something honestly and with good intentions if they don't want to do it. You can't make them open up to other people or ideas if they don't want to. What I currently see as potentially beneficial is an open and honest, and sometimes even provocative discourse about the commonalities and differences between the two groups, about their strengths and weaknesses, and about what each group should learn from the other, and vice versa. This would certainly upset many people, but it would also encourage them to think and perhaps, over time, become less closed-minded and more accepting of well-argued points.
Your skepticism is completely understandable and prompts a more nuanced consideration. Indeed, one cannot force anyone to be open or reduce their prejudices. Inner change must come from the individuals themselves. In this context, an open, honest, and provocative discourse seems like a promising approach to encourage people to rethink. Here are some thoughts on this. When people do not have the internal will to embrace change, external formal measures will have little effect. However, direct discourse can challenge existing attitudes by showing the benefits of reflecting on one's own prejudices, whether in the form of personal development or societal strength. Provocative discussions can break existing comfort zones and force people to reconsider their assumptions. Such a discourse, which highlights both the strengths and weaknesses of both groups, can help uncover blind spots. For instance, by critically questioning how short-term gratifying mechanisms like scapegoating can hinder long-term problem-solving, space for constructive engagement is created. An honest exchange about commonalities and differences promotes self-reflection, not only on an individual level but also within the groups. If members from both sides experience that their own cultural or social framework can be strengthened in dialogue, the discourse becomes a tool that contributes to improving society as a whole. While you can't make anyone open up, you can still create platforms and forums where controversial and provocative topics are addressed openly. Such spaces, whether in the form of public debates, panel discussions, or digital formats, provide opportunities for people who otherwise live in isolation to engage with others in a safe environment and reconsider their perspectives. The challenge, therefore, is to design the discourse in a way that it doesn't just provoke, but also stimulates reflection and makes the benefits of a nuanced, inclusive attitude visible. What, in your opinion, could such a discourse format look like in practice?
Yes, creating forums and platforms for this discourse could be useful. I also agree with you that the participants would need to constantly strive to keep the discourse constructive, despite the openness and provocation. The discourse should not degenerate into mutual antagonism or disparagement but should always be oriented toward the good, both for oneself and for others. Of course, one cannot force people to want the good, but I believe that the majority of people do genuinely want the good, at least in the abstract. Therefore, voices that lean in this direction would be elevated, and voices that seek violence and conflict would be excluded and criticized. But ultimately, there can be no guarantee of a good outcome if the discourse is open. Well, that's enough for today. Thank you for the interesting reflection on this topic. Until next time.
You're very welcome. Thank you as well for this intense and constructive exchange. It was enriching to explore the complexity of prejudices and integration processes together and to critically reflect on the possibilities of an honest discourse. I look forward to continuing our discussion when the opportunity arises. Until next time.